Today's speaker is Jill Moss Greenberg. Some of you already know her. She's a club member. She is activist extraordinaire. She's been sort of a mentor to me. When I grow up, I want to be Jill Moss Greenberg. She is going to talk about women making good trouble and sort of an overview of the women getting the right to vote. Jill, are you unmuted?
I just unmuted.
All right. Come on in.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks. First, I want to thank Heather, who did this amazing job. I have now, with good alliteration, named her Heather Houdini because she does such magic in the slides. I am so pleased to be talking with the people of Solarian today and talking about the struggle of this brave and courageous women who fought for women's suffrage, and one of the longest struggles for social reform in the whole history of the United States. And it's so important we see it that way. Women were not given the vote. Women struggled and fought and persisted in order to gain it. What we're doing here is not going over the history of the whole suffrage movement, because that's done with media this year. Look at the vote on PBS, which is a tremendous documentary, and the National Women's History Alliance to get full information. I'm going to highlight certain points and areas and some parallels for today that I found this amazing parallel that I thought was so important to be aware of. What were we doing in the villages? Go back one, Heather, please. We formed a coalition called Sisters of Suffrage. It's maybe one of the first activist women's coalition in the villages, which has women's organizations from the villages and the neighboring communities that have been meeting for over a year already to help promote awareness and learning about suffrage. Our email address is on the bottom there. Please get in touch if you want to know more. At the bottom of this slide, very important, you'll see the sash I'm wearing. There's confusion among people about the term suffragette or suffragist. People who saw Mary Poppins knew Sister Suffragette. That was England, was suffragette. Suffragist is the American term, and our colors are purple, white, and gold. Now, next slide, Heather. What I wanted to do always is to honor the people who come before us. In this land here, before the suffrage movement happened, there were Native American women in tribal nations who had the right to vote in their tribal nations. And we have so much to learn from them, and at some point we can talk about that as well. Asking for the right to vote, demanding the right to vote, was first recorded by Margaret Brent in Maryland in 1648, 200 years before the Seneca Falls Convention that was supposed to start the women's suffrage movement. And last, I want to highlight the Western United States, because out there, we didn't have interstate highways. It took a lot to get out west. Very strong women were out there, and the men wanted to attract more women out there. So they were very strong on women voting. And when Wyoming applied to join the Union, the Congress said, if you join, you have to stop women from voting. And Wyoming said, we would rather stay out of the Union for 100 years than come in without our women. And that was a very important achievement, and a lot of the Western states, 11 Western states, joined in. Heather, next slide, please. Wanted to give you a sense of what it was like at the time, because it's so easy to see these pictures of these women and see what they're like. But they weren't allowed out of the house very much, except if you were employed, lower income household worker, indentured servant. Middle-class women had to have a male accompanying them to be out in public. Couldn't wear slacks. Some of you are very radical today. So how did women get together? They could leave home to have tea with the ladies. So these women got together to have tea, and they used the teas to strategize, to develop political strategies, to develop resources, pamphlets, and lobbying techniques. And from there, they went on to far greater organizing. But some of the beginning of the women's suffrage movement happened at tea parties. Next one, Heather. Think of bicycles. Some of you, I assume, have ridden a bicycle. Though bicycles only came to be in the US in the about 1860s. Again, giving a sense of the time. The bicycle gave women freedom. They could go out alone, unaccompanied on their bikes. And Susan B. Anthony said to the reporter Nellie Bly, "Let me tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. You bike riders may not have thought of them that way, but it gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel, the picture of free, untrammeled womanhood." Very different. And they had to ride in skirts in the beginning. Okay, next slide, Heather, please. Wanted to show you some suffrage moments. Part of what, in reframing history, is looking at the complexity of it. Women like Harriet Tubman, that many of you know from Harriet and the Underground Railroad and so forth, but may not know that she was an active suffragist. So the dual roles. And women of color in particular had to deal with the intersectionality of racism and sexism. And they were instrumental in addressing those issues. Some of the people you may not think of who were suffragists, one of Floridian was Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, which we've heard about from the high school that's named for her in Florida. And we mostly know her for the Everglades, but she was a strong suffragist. So those are examples of women who, from many walks of life, were engaged in this movement. And there were men who were allies and partners. Frederick Douglass, who was a freed slave, runaway slave, really, was actually at the Seneca Falls conference. He was one of a handful of men, and he was the only African-American. There were no African-American women. Frederick Douglass is the person who seconded the motion to have a suffrage amendment. He was the one who persuaded people to go for it. On the right of Frederick Douglass is typical of the antis, the people against the women's suffrage, which were women and men, had this type of ads out all the time. Postcards, posters. This man wants to vote, but his wife wouldn't let him. I think that is incredible, that the antis were afraid about changing family, who would take care of the home. Maybe the Bible said there were different roles prescribed for women and for men. There were also, and this is so modern, corporate interests that were dramatically opposed to suffrage. The main corporate opponent to women's suffrage was the liquor industry, because some of the women had come out of prohibition movement. The liquor manufacturers, the distillers, the brewers were all concerned that they would lose their profit and their markets if women had the right to vote. And in fact, they gave samples of their products to legislators right before they went to vote on women's suffrage, which often helped bring them along to their anti-cause. They also were afraid that because so many women had come out of the anti-slavery movement, that it would reduce white supremacy if women were allowed to vote. On the bottom line on this slide, first is the Democratic women, some of them lining up for the Women's March on Washington. It happened in 1913, the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. That was the first Women's March on Washington before presidential inauguration. And on the right, I want to include the Republican women because they were very clever. They were trying to get a suffrage plank in the 1916 Republican Convention, and they enlisted some help from the Chicago Zoo to make their point about including women's suffrage. Next page, please. What I also want for you to understand, oh, you Solarians, is that it was a diversity of women that were there, because what we usually have seen covered was not a diversity. We picture more Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. All of these kinds of groups were involved, and I hope you can see all of them. The one I'm going to just feature briefly is Mary McLeod Bethune, because she also was from Florida, settled in Florida, started what is now Bethune-Cookman College. She was an educator, civil rights activist, befriended Eleanor Roosevelt and advised her. What's exciting right now about Mary McLeod Bethune, who's one of my idols, is that she is the person whose statue will be going into the US Capitol representing the state of Florida instead of the statue of the Confederate general that is now to come out of the US Capitol. I think that's a huge victory, and this is the image of who's going in. Then I started seeing things that were parallel universe from then to now. Ida B. Wells on the right side was an intrepid journalist. She fought for the intersection of race and gender. She was not willing to be relegated to the back of the Women's March, and she marched with the Chicago delegation, but also she did intrepid investigative journalism, pioneering journalism against lynching. Lynching has come up very much this year, again, because of a modern lynching that so many of us are aware of. Ida B. Wells, this year, 2020, was awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting on lynching. Helen Keller I put there because, again, we have stereotypic views of what women have accomplished. And Helen Keller was a staunch suffragist. Helen Keller went to New York State, and this is one of my favorite stories. She went to New York State with a petition signed by 5,000 women for a social welfare issue. When she spoke with the chair of the committee in the New York State legislature, he said, a petition signed by 5,000 women, that's not worth the paper it's written on. Give me something signed by 5 men and I'll look at it. And Helen Keller said, that's one of the reasons why we're demanding that women have the right to vote, because we don't want 5,000 women to have at least as much credibility as 5 men. Down at the bottom, I have the fake news. And Ida B. Wells was so important that it was rampant then. Ida B. Wells, one of her famous quotes is that the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And in her writing, especially about lynching, she did that and countered the fake news. Next panel. All right, this is also very modern, parallel to what's been happening now. The women in the upper left were picketing in front of the White House. They were the first, the suffragists were the first to ever picket the White House. And on the right is a picture of the women, some of the suffragists protesting in Lafayette Park across from the White House. Some of you now know that park has been renamed Black Lives Matter Plaza. There are the suffragists there 100 years ago protesting and pioneering that social activism. Below, you'll see some things about women who were arrested for their work. They were abused. Pictures here from Iron Jawed Angels, if you saw dramatized what happened in Occoquan and where they were in prison, just to give you an idea that it wasn't all just peaceful protesting. There was a lot of violence involved and a lot of abuse, including by police and authorities. The other parallel universe is that they were also had fake charges or false or inaccurate charges. You see at the bottom, they want to be imprisoned as political offenders, not criminal offenders. And we see that with some of our protesters today as well. I put in Ocoee because it brings us home to Florida. Even after women got the right to vote, looking to the 1920 election was the first time a Black gentleman from Lake City, Florida, who actually gave classes to teach Black women how to fill in their ballots, was taken from his home by the Ku Klux Klan, and a noose was put around his neck for teaching Black women to complete ballots. You talk about voter suppression and what we think of it today. And in Ocoee, which is only about an hour from here, go back to Ocoee for 1 minute, Heather. In Ocoee, occurred one of the worst massacres in the whole history of the United States when Black residents went to vote for the first time, including women. They were massacred by the Klan and others. Lynchings occurred. Over 50 people were killed. And all of the Black homes and businesses were burned to the ground. I'm glad to say that this year in the Florida State Legislature, they actually passed a bill to require that the Ocoee Massacre is taught in the public schools of the state of Florida. If you talk about voter suppression, and we do, think about the extremes that were occurring back then. And the final parallel, the suffragists were dealing with World War I, and now the pandemic. You know, the pandemic of 2020. This was the pandemic of 1918. They had been working for the passage of the 19th Amendment for 70 years, the war and all of the other barriers, and then the flu hit. They didn't have email, they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have internet. How do you communicate when you are interned, when you had to stay home, when the legislators had to stay home? And the challenge was immense, but the women persisted. They persisted. They got in touch with legislators. They sent packets. They worked and lobbied, and the 19th Amendment was passed in spite of the pandemic. We can do the same. Go to the next slide, Heather. They persisted and they won. The amendment was passed by Congress. I should note Florida technically didn't pass it till May 13th, 1969, although they did allow women to vote in between. But I don't want to give any illusion. Even though it was passed, women of color could not vote. People of color really had difficulty in voting. And it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that everyone really could act. And as we know, that's something currently before Congress for reauthorization in fullness, and is now named for John Lewis. Okay, Heather. Last, they persisted and they won. The unfinished agenda we have is the Equal Rights Amendment, which would be another amendment to the Constitution. And I wanted to make sure all of you in Solarian know that the Equal Rights Amendment was actually written in 1923 and is still ongoing, and an ongoing unfinished agenda. I put down in the bottom of this slide the email address for the ERA Coalition, where you can find out all the up-to-date information on the status and help lend your support. Last, Heather, we started this year on January 1st with the Rose Bowl Parade, and we had a suffrage float that many of us contributed to have happen. In the suffrage parade was the float, and then 100 women walked behind it dressed in white with suffrage banners. It was incredibly moving. And we were citing the message, and that's the message from the suffragists for us today, that failure is impossible, that persistence is what wins. And from the National Association of Colored Women, which was started also during the suffrage movement, the other message, the banner, is lifting as we climb. As we move forward, lift others with us, bring other people along, lift as we climb, and then failure is impossible to achieving justice for everyone. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.